Mayor Burris.
Here. We do not have a quorum. This will not be an official meeting. So this is just a town hall discussion. I am I going to turn it over to you first or to Mr. Vaselli?
I think I can go ahead and just kind of kick it off, but this was a meeting that was requested by Councilmember Phillips and Mayor Burris to put out some information. I believe they were getting questions on TIF, and Councilmember Phillips worked with our legal and put together a presentation, and I think it's appropriate to turn it over to Councilmember Phillips to do that presentation along with the attorney.
Thank you, Mr. Vaselli, or excuse me, Mr. Dossi, I'm sorry.
I don't get paid that much, contrary to what popular belief is.
Well, thank you to everyone who came tonight, and thank you to anyone who's watching on YouTube. We do have a special thing tonight. We're trying new with YouTube. So those of you who happen to turn in live, if there's anyone out there, you do have an opportunity to submit questions. Those questions will be monitored by the Pekin staff, city staff, and appropriate questions will be relayed to our experts who are here tonight to answer any questions that we can. As Mayor Mary said, my name is Peg Phillips. I am a member of the City Council. I am also a CPA and work with the University of Illinois Tax School, writing educational materials and editing them. So I put together a very, very rough draft of what I hope to tell everyone tonight. And I want to thank Mr. Vaselli's law office. His assistant Stephanie did a wonderful job of turning my rough draft into something that looks really pretty. So we're calling this TIF 101 because I'm not here to get into any of the details. Mr. Vaselli can get into the more complicated things. But about 6 weeks ago or so, I was sitting around talking with one of my good friends, and she said, I don't understand why we're helping people who can afford to build a $300,000 house. And I sat there and I said, well, this is why we do it, blah, 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 blah. And I thought, hey, that sounded really good. Maybe I should share this information with other people who have that same basic question. So my goal here tonight is to just cover this like I'm telling my friends. So TIF 101, basic, how it works and what it means for the homeowners. There we go. So that is our first slide. This is my first time getting to use a remote on slides. So y'all forgive me if I click wrong. But I'm going to walk through a real example of a residential TIF in Pekin Marigold Estates, Phase 12. Now, I want you to take a good look at the picture of the Marigold Estates sign. And know that on both sides of this street, these are there. And for a large portion of my life, there were two great big beautiful signs and one street. It always just cracked me up. So I want you to remember this when we get a little further in the presentation. I'm so old that I grew up in this neighborhood back in the last century. And we managed to pull some old GIS maps up and circled there where my house was when I was growing up in Holiday Hills. And you see that about 2 blocks over, the neighborhood ends. That's it. That was all there was. And it was so exciting to walk from my house 2 blocks down and play in the cornfields. This is one of my best memories, was searching through those cornfields. What's exciting? It's nature. So, wait a minute. I skipped ahead a little too far. Okay. Okay, well, I lost one of my slides. Well, anyway, the other slide was going to show you that at the same time that this was not a neighborhood, the Lick Creek Golf Course wasn't even built. And it looked like a bunch of trees. Then they came in and they built Parkway. That was so cool. And then nothing. For years. You drive down Parkway and there's no development. There's nothing, that's a road to nowhere. Well, finally, so in the 1990s, this is where I was referring to the signs at the side of the street, they added Marigold Drive. That was it, one street in the 90s. In 2007, the land that's becoming the homestead in our little story here was part of a much larger parcel. And a developer had big plans. They came in and they're going to build a brand new neighborhood. Well, the project didn't move forward. The lot sat vacant for 5 more years. So in 2007, the developer comes in and says, well, I'm going to make this neighborhood. In 2012, there's still nothing going on. Well, I don't know what happened, but I did find in the tax records that the sheriff had to sell this property to a different developer. So whoever had it couldn't make it work. So what happened during 2006 to 2012? The empty lots generated $87, that should be singular, by the way. The empty lot generated $87.40 in total property taxes for city, county, parks, schools combined. That's 2006 to 2012. We got a total of $87, and we split it up amongst everybody. So over that period, we got $13. 2011, I love Google Maps. That is what our lot looked like in 2011. So what changed and why does it matter? A new developer came in and invested in the basic infrastructure. The roads, the curbs, the access to the sewers, the water utilities, excuse me, making the neighborhood buildable. Once the neighborhood was developed, the lot began generating over $500 a year in property taxes that went to the city, the county, the park, and the school services. So we went from getting $18 over 7 years, we got $77 the first year the developer came in and upped up the value of the property by putting in the developments. In 2023, the developer sold the lot, in our example, to a couple who planned on building their retirement home. And the total purchase price of this home was the lot, was $35,000. So, let's say, private investment follows infrastructure. So they bought the lot in 2023, and over the course of the next year or so, they put $290,000 in to construct their home and do the basic landscaping. This is what you get for approximately $300,000 in investment in building a new home. And I personally think when I think $300,000 house, I think about my house and I think, oh, somebody just got a McMansion. But this is a very modest home. Unfortunately, in today's, we'll cover this a little bit more in a second, but that's the cost of building it. Once it's built, that doesn't mean our couple can turn around and sell it for $300,000. The market value is what they could get somebody else to pay them to give it up. And we'll see on this next slide, that it's kind of hard to read a small print on here, but the fair cash value, the county believes it's only worth $190,000 despite the money put in. Just keeping that in mind, that what we think of and what actually get out of it, in today's market, building a $300,000 home is just a modest middle-class home. So what happened before and after the construction? How did the development affect the taxes without increasing the city share? So in 2023, we had a vacant lot. The total tax bill was $575 and change. The assessed fair cash value of the lot was under $20,000. In 2024, after the home was completed, the property tax bill was $5,305 and change. And the assessed value is $189,630. What happened with the TIF? We want to know, why do we do the TIF? What's going on with the money? So approximately, I'm going to call it 2/3 of the net income that we got from the $5,300, we're giving them back to the homeowners to help them pay for the lot that they used to build the house on. So after we give this rebate, we're going to get $73 a year, which is what we were getting before we agreed to the rebate. So, doing a little more math here. The city share explained. We get the $72 a year, which was what we were getting from the property before the homeowners built on it. We look at the vacant lot shares, we got almost nothing out of it. The TIF increment, that increase is handled by the statute that shows how the money goes. We also have an agreement with other governmental agencies that say, well, we gave back approximately 2/3 to the homeowner, and now we're going to make sure that you're not suffering from losing out on this other third. We're going to keep our $72, and we'll rebate the rest to you guys. That's the other tax. Now, I'd like to say, give Mark Twain credit for lies. Oh, that is not the version I wrote. Okay, so it's lies, Mark Twain's version, and our version, darn lies and statistics. Why the math matters more than the headline. And from an accounting, fiscal, financial, nerd thing, what we would do to say what the dollar values are is we'd say, all right, well, the value of the money we're giving out now versus the value of the money we're going to get later, indexed for inflation and adjusted for this and based on these assumptions. That's why I didn't do any of that math, because it's all based on the assumptions. We're not actually losing any revenue right now because we weren't getting that money. But down the line, within 10, 15 years or so, it says 18 here, whatever, that we will get money in the future that we're not getting now. So it's not costing us anything now, and in the future, the money will come in. So we want to emphasize here, this is math that we know is factual. It's not based on any assumptions. We received less than $1,000 over 18 years. That's it. That's all we got out of that lot. And we got that money, we got to spend it how we wanted to. From 24 to approximately 2032, that's 8 years, the city will continue to receive the same annual general tax revenues that we were getting before. Okay. During that period, the homeowners get their temporary refund, and is not the full amount that it went up. Once the entire purchase price of the lot is recovered, then the rebate term ends and we get the money forever. That's our goal, as long as we stay as a city and as long as the property doesn't burn down. So the bottom line is, these programs don't reduce our revenue. We're not out anything. Our long-term capacity increases once the rebate period ends. The question is fundamentally, would this property have been developed this soon, without the TIF project incentives? Would the developer been able to sell the property to our sweet retired couple? Or would our sweet retired couple have gone to some other town that does offer these kind of rebates? We can't know for sure, but we believe that it helps bring people in and decide to invest here instead of somewhere else. Would the infrastructure happened if we hadn't agreed to the TIF district with the developer? Maybe the developer would have gone somewhere else. In today's environment, what it is, that we're always competing with other people who also, other cities, other municipalities, other villages specifically, who also want people to come and live in their towns, bring in not just the property tax revenues, but the sales tax revenues and all the business to our local businesses, et cetera, et cetera. So we don't know if it would have happened, but we know that by doing it, it did. And it's hopefully will end up in the long term being beneficial to us. So we're just going to look this slide on summarizing the dollars. From 2006 to 2023, we got less than $6,000 total. From 2024, that first year, that $5,000 represents, 18 years of, already that's more than we were getting before. So we're going to give part of it back. We're going to send out part of it to the other people. And after all the rebates are done, voila, we have revenue for the future. So that's why we do it. You know, we can argue about whether or not our assumption that it encourages development to happen sooner. That is, we'll never be able to prove one way or another. The reason we do it is because we believe that it probably works better than not doing it. And again, I want to thank Mr. Vaselli's staff, Stephanie. I want to thank Josh for his help pulling together the numbers. And I want to thank all of you who came out tonight when you could be Christmas shopping. And I hope that everyone has a great holiday season, that you enjoy everything you celebrate. We will be opening for questions after our Mr. Vaselli gives his presentation on the complicated portions.
Thank you, Peg. Thank you. Mr. Vaselli,
Thank you.
this is TIF, a deeper dive.
So we called this, and again, we'll do an introduction in a second, but thank you, Madam Mayor. We call this portion of the presentation TIF, a deeper dive, because it goes into the more mundane process and procedural aspects of the tax increment financing system as adopted by the state of Illinois. Tax increment financing, before I even get into this, started out in the state of California before 1980. And its system looks a lot more like what SSAs are. So I'm sure a bunch of you, either on YouTube or here, are familiar with SSAs. And so a California permutation of TIF is different than an Illinois one, because California's is much more like an SSA or a special service area that we have here in Illinois. So I'm this guy. My name is James Vaselli, and I am a principal at Vaselli Law LLC. I've been practicing law for over 20 years and TIF law for over 20 years. And I'm legal counsel to municipalities across Illinois. I would like to thank the city for inviting me to be here and help out with this matter. Councilmember Phillips for her curiosity with regards to this and the impetus to go forward and put on this presentation, and my colleagues, Amalia, who's sitting here with me tonight, Stephanie, who put a lot of time and effort into this and trying to make a very academic and kind of boring topic palatable for people to understand, and my colleague Aaron, who works with me in a bunch of TIF deals throughout the state of Illinois. One of our proudest accomplishments is actually that one of our projects won the Center for Development and Finance Authority's TIF Project of the Year for a redevelopment project in the city of Berwyn, Illinois, where we took basically vacant land and turned it into a Five Guys. If you're familiar with Five Guys burgers, they're very good burgers. This is not an endorsement, and this presentation is not sponsored by Five Guys. The Buffalo Wild Wings, Chipotle, and 2 retail stores from what was generating 0 tax or sales tax dollars. And I'm going to touch on something that Councilmember did not mention, and I'm sure she left it for me to mention, about the additional revenues that come off of TIF. So this session matters because TIF isn't optional. Compliance is the job. These are processes that have to be followed for transparency and accountability to make sure that we do these things the right way. People wrongly accuse TIF districts of being slush funds for developers. That's just not true. It's just not true. It is not something where money is just thrown into a pot and it goes there. There are steps, there are procedures, there's processes, there's accounting, there's transparencies, and there's reporting requirements, all of which we'll get in here too tonight. So tonight's agenda are the foundations of the TIF, the statutory requirements, the high-risk areas, the things that we really watch out for as practitioners in this area, oversight and transparency, the public process, and then as the council member was very nice to say, we'll have a little question and answer for anyone who has any questions or comments, thoughts with regards to the thrilling and dramatic topic of tax increment financing. So there's some basics. So we call this TIF foundations, what every public body must know. And this is a state law. So there are standards and steps that must be taken when implementing a TIF district and when ensuring compliance with the same. So TIF starts with one rule. Development must not occur but for the public investment. So I want to touch back on, and the council member gave a much more, let's say, interesting presentation than I did. But she kept on saying, if you remember in her last couple slides, it was about, would this happen? Would this happen? It wouldn't happen, but for. So there's a but for test. Would projects happen? Would development, redevelopment occur if we didn't TIF it? And the point of her, and why we wanted to transition into this point, is that developments don't happen, and there's factors that show that, but for tax increment financing coming in there. So TIF is governed by state law. So every municipality in the state of Illinois that has a TIF district followed the same procedures then applicable. It is temporary. It lasts generally for 23 years. Intermodal TIFs have 35 years. There are extensions that are done under great scrutiny by the state legislature. TIF is restricted. You can't just pay for TIF to buy everybody a new pair of shoes or a long pair of pants because it's cold in the winter. TIF has to be used for certain things as defined in the Act. That Act is found at 65 ILCS 5/1174.4, and you can find those eligibility constraints under subsection Q of that Act. and TIF is audited. So my first boss was my colleague, Ms. Rioja, over here. And one of our jobs was to ensure that every municipality that had a TIF district every year filed their annual reports, annual TIF reports, ATRs. And they have meetings of all the other taxing districts. A lot of this we'll get into later, but called joint review board meetings. So bottom line, TIF is a legal framework, not a shortcut. You have to follow every step of the process to perfect a TIF, to create a TIF, to ordain a TIF, or to certify a TIF. And again, every municipality that has a TIF district follows these same steps. So we, as lawyers, I always say that it's sometimes not about what happens, but what you can prove. It's not about the stories that you tell, but what you can prove. It's not about what you can say, but what actually you can prove in a court of law. And the TIF Act and how we interpret it in the state of Illinois follows the same way. Eligibility is not assumed. Statutory findings must be documented and defensible. They must be proven. So blight or conservation findings are required. So again, in that same act, you have to go through and make sure you read them and that they meet these certain statutory, these legal requirements to be able to have a TIF district. You have to have independent studies. When we do TIF districts, we make sure that there's studies that are attached, flooding studies, contamination studies, topographical studies, sizing studies for odd-shaped lots, or a lack of property growth that could come through, such as what your Marigold Estates was. And then you have to have a gap. You have to have a financial analysis that shows that there would be a gap before a project coming through or not. And the findings are subject to challenge. So many times we are in a situation where before a court or another tribunal, we have to defend these actual findings. And we have actual reports that go into it, such as a flooding report. So again, you have to prove that the property should be located in a TIF district. So the plain rule, if there are no findings, there is no TIF district. So you have to be able to prove the reasons that you say you need a TIF district because of the deficiencies of the land for development, because of these problems with the land for development, for example, contamination or flooding or topographical issues, bumpy land. You have to show that it's there for a TIF district to be properly ordained. So this is what the but-for test looks like in practice. So if a project would move forward and there was no public assistance, then it would not qualify for a TIF. So if you know the development's coming in, or you know that people would do it without this tax increment financing relief, then you cannot certify this as a TIF district. If the documented barriers prevent development without assistance, the TIF may be considered, but it's subject to findings and review. Again, we have to prove or be subject to challenge, be subject to court action, that this would happen or this wouldn't happen. So let's talk about the hard limits of what the law requires. So the law demands a couple things as we go through with regards to the TIF district and its creation and its following up of the same. So there's three ordinances. There are three ordinances that are adopted by a city, village, or town before a TIF district is ordained, certified, or perfected. There's one that says we can use tax increment financing. There's one that says, yes, we agree with the plan that's set forth in the TIF district, the eligibility plan and the redevelopment plan. And there's one that says, yes, these are the boundaries of the TIF district. There's a public hearing process. Multiple times in any city, village, or town, you would come and be notified of a public hearing where you could come up and speak about this and give written findings or oral findings about what you believe this TIF is. And then there is a joint review board, which is related to this, but this is comprised of all of those other taxing districts that levy a tax on the property that go in the TIF district. In plain English, schools, some libraries, the county. Sometimes wastewater districts can come in there and make statements as well, even though they're not under the statutory requirement for that. And they're reporting in term limits. There's an annual reporting, and there's generally a 23-year maximum term, but that can be amended by state statute, and there are different terms for different type of TIF districts in some certain reasons. So again, the devil's in the details. The key takeaway from all this is that there are many details that go involved in this. You can't just say, we think there's water on the property, it should be in a TIF district. We can't just say, oh, I saw somebody spill a can of paint on the property, so it's contaminated, it's got to be in a TIF district. There are actual studies that go into this, and there are actual steps that go into the process to make sure that this is done correctly. And then after it's done correctly, actual steps that are taken to make sure that it's being handled and managed in the right way. So, there's high-risk areas. So where do TIFs get into trouble? Where do you see most of the conflicts about TIFs? Where do you see most of the court actions about TIFs? So bad findings. So you really need to spend a lot of time, and you have to have a good TIF consultant that goes through and finds other consultants to say, yes, this property is deficient, this property won't develop, this property should be eligible for a TIF district, or they won't issue a TIF district. So weak blight analysis, like I said. Well, we've got some water over here, so it's got to be flooding. We've spilled some paint, or there was maybe one spill of some garbage can out there, and so it's got to be contaminated. That's not enough. You need real findings that go through on this. Incomplete but-for documentation, and that's what we talked about. A lot of times you'll see us, what they call an inducement resolution that says, developer, we know you won't come here for the TIF, so we make that finding right up ahead. We make sure that we're secure on that as a municipality. And over-reliance on consultant conclusions. So you really need to go through and pick it over with a fine-tooth comb. You need to spend the time to go through the studies and make sure they're accurate and check with staff, make sure everything's put on file for review and subject to that. The other problems, improper use of TIF funds. Like I said, you can't use it for non-eligible costs. You can't just say, we're going to give everybody $100 out of the TIF district for whatever reason. It just doesn't work. You can't use it for general salaries or overhead for the municipality. Second point, and then it's a weak nexus to redevelopment. You really need to show that these things are going to tie together to ensure a higher tax base for the corporate authorities of that municipality. So eligibility means more than intent. Everyone has heard the phrase that, good intentions are the pathway to a very bad place. What we really need here are findings and facts and steps that show that we need to do this and have done it the right way and use the money the right way. Because to feel good about something is great, but we have to make sure that we deliver. So we're going to talk a lot tonight about a term that I'm going to call surplus. And we have surplus, and it's a very technical definition. And I don't save enough money. It's kind of an American thing to do, to not save enough money. So surplus is not just having extra money, but surplus is not having a use for that extra money. So excess funds sitting idle, it's surplus. The missed statutory deadlines and failure to distribute to taxing bodies. So what surplus is not saving money for a long-term project. And we're going to get into this more in detail because it gets confused a lot, especially by the other taxing districts. But surplus is just having money laying around like a slush fund. The TIF Act does not allow for that. What the TIF Act does allow for is putting money aside and allocating it for a future project. And I want to make sure that distinction is very clear. Because you can't just have money laying around and not allocate it. That doesn't work. But what does work is building up credit equity, or I should say financial funds, to go forward with a larger project. Most TIF problems stem from process, not intent. So again, good feelings. We all think this is going to be great. Yay. But we need to take the real steps. We need to have real findings. We need to make sure the processes are followed before, during, and after the ordaining, meaning passing of an ordinance, process. Oversight and transparency, checks, reviews, and public accountability. So I believe one of the largest ways that we have oversight of TIF districts is what's called a joint review board. And if you remember, I talked about that a little bit earlier. The joint review board is an independent review by affected taxing bodies. Those taxing bodies include community college districts. It's different because of how different cities, towns, and villages are organized. Libraries, community unit school districts, grade school districts, high school districts, park districts, the county, and other bodies show up, like I said, like wastewater districts in some places, but they are not really part of the ARB, but they do contribute often. And this serves as an independent body to review what goes on, both as you're forming a TIF district and for the annual TIF reports, the ATRs, like we talked about. So an independent review is required by law. And this is both at the beginning of the process and during the process that goes on for, let's say, the 23 years. The taxing bodies are representative, either a lawyer, a financial manager, a business district person, a superintendent shows up. And their eligibility findings are reviewed. And this is what we're talking about for the beginning of it. Are these really proper reasons that we should have a TIF district? Advisory recommendation is issued, and then a written report is required. That report goes to the corporate authorities, meaning the city council in this case, and it's voted on. If the JRB votes against it, then it goes to a supermajority vote. So that is a protection to ensure the standards are there. The Joint Review Board, if you read the act, also says that it can look and ensure that the TIF district in that place is congruent. It works with the planning for the area. So key decisions are reviewed, but not made in isolation. So there is a presentation that goes on as to why we're doing these things. Normally, the TIF consultant goes on with city staff and talks about how we move this, why we are doing this, how we are moving this forward, and then questions and answers occur from the Joint Review Board. Annual TIF reports. You may have heard me say this about 5 or 6 times before tonight, but ATRs. These are the annual reports that go in and they get submitted eventually to the comptroller's office, where some of us have worked before, to ensure that there is compliance with the TIF Act. These are ongoing disclosure steps and for financial review. So the annual TIF reports are required. They review expenditures and revenues. They are submitted to the taxing bodies and they are filed with the state comptroller. There is a requirement for them that comes in after the audit is done, and you do receive sanctions if you don't do them on time. So what we need to understand is TIF activity remains visible year after year. Every year there is a ATR. Every year there's supposed to be a JRB. You can go and find those ATRs at the comptroller's website. You can also go and find those oftentimes on municipal websites. Or you could show up for your Joint Review Board hearing. It is a public meeting governed by the Open Meetings Act, and you feel free to attend. Surplus and financial accountability. Excess funds must be addressed. So unused surplus funds are not discretionary. Surplus funds are identified, statutory deadlines apply, funds are to be shared with the taxing body. So if there is no use for these funds, it gets redistributed out to the taxing bodies if there's not already an agreement in place. So in some instances, there's already an agreement in place for the taxing bodies to go through, and they get a proportion of the money declared as surplus. Otherwise, if there's surplus and there's not something that's being done or being taken care of, it just gets distributed out. And the failure to create exposure. When I say exposure, that generally means a lawsuit or legal action. So we could have a planned fund balance versus a surplus. And again, we kind of talked about that before, so I'll buzz through that slide a little bit. We have to determine and evaluate these annually. And not all TIF balances are surpluses, but surpluses must be identified when they exist. Public access and disclosure. TIF records are public records. So redevelopment agreements are public. So every time we give away an incentive, there's some form of agreement called either an economic incentive agreement or a redevelopment agreement. For purposes of today, I'll just refer to them as redevelopment agreements. they have to be approved by the body that would normally sit behind me, the city council. So they're always on an agenda, they're always out there, they're always subject to review. Their financial records are accessible. We kind of talked about that. The financial records with regards to the ATRs and the TIF process and the numbers that go into that are kept on file at the city. Reporting documents are disclosable, as I said. When we file our ATRs, just like every other municipality in the state of Illinois, they are filed with the comptroller's office. They have a database. You can pull up their website 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. And transparency is expected. So you have to be transparent with this. You have to go through and you have to make sure that the steps that you need to take to show the people how you're using the money and show the people these steps in the process that are going on are actually being done. So like I said, if you remember, I was talking about the Joint Review Board. This goes on throughout the whole process. There's always an examination to make sure that these things are done the right way, that there's transparency and fiscal accountability. The TIF Act has some of the most stringent notice, hearing, and public participation requirements. So notices are mailed and published. There are numerous hearings that need to be held, including the JRB, like we were talking about. Public comment is required. You always have to give public comment. It's an Open Meetings Act issue, just like every other meeting. And the changes may require new hearings. I observed a colleague who actually changed the boundaries of a TIF district at a certain point in time, and they had to start from scratch. So if you've ever played the game Monopoly, do not pass go, do not collect $200. They had to start all the way over and do the whole thing because they may have failed in one step. So you have to be very careful and specific and deliberate about this process. So the notices and the hearings safeguard transparency. So the way that we safeguard transparency in all levels of law, from the local level all the way to the federal, is providing people notice to give them the numbers to look at and make informed decisions themselves, whether that's a council member or members of the public or members of the Joint Review Board. So we give notice. We have hearings. We invite people to come here to talk about these things. And honestly, if I didn't bore you enough about the tax increment financing in the state of Illinois, we open this up for questions and comments. I'm going to skip around a little bit. I just want to thank everybody for their time. I know this is not a thrilling subject. This is not the glamorous parts of the law, but it is an important one, and it's one that hits the news a lot. And it's one that, honestly, I really credit the council member for saying, let's inform and educate people about this. And if you have any questions, obviously, that's our contact information. So I will go back to questions, answers, and discussion. So thank you.
Okay, I would now like to open it up to the floor for questions. Our staff will help answer anything. This is Mr. Joshua Ray. He will hand the mic around. If anybody has a question, please raise your hand. Oh, which one you want first?
My name is Chris Meyer. I'm a retired CPA. I see what you said about how you form the TIFs. Where does the money come from for these TIFs?
Great question. So the money for the TIF districts comes from, when the TIF is formed, there's a baseline of all the taxes, okay? And then the increase of that because of the development. So there's tax growth because of that. That increase is called the tax increment. And that's where the money comes from. So all of the taxing bodies' levy amounts are frozen, or tax levels are frozen. And then as it increases due to the development, and that's why the but-for is so important, that money from the TIF let me state back. That real estate tax money, as it increases, is known as increment, and that's the TIF. That is a tax increment financing.
So it comes from the taxpayers?
Yes, the taxpayers pay.
I'm not sure, Mayor.
Yeah, please.
I don't want to interrupt the expert, but I think I understand the question. I'm not positive. So let me back up. In our example, we had they were paying $72 a year in property taxes before it was developed. The neighborhood got developed and they start paying $500. At that point, we were in a TIF district, right?
I don't think so in your specific example.
Okay, so we get the 500, it gets spread out amongst everybody. We're not actually taking any money of our own to pay anybody at this juncture. The money that the new homeowner pays in for the property taxes, we give them back some of it. So it's not coming from anybody else's pocket. It's they gave it to us, we give it back to them. Then we take what's left over and spread it out amongst the other people. So decades down the line, however many years it takes before we've got the lot repaid, that money that comes in, that money goes into the TIF district to be spent on other road improvements, infrastructure, things that the town needs to develop. There's a lot of rules about whether this money can go to that neighborhood or not. Depends on how the legal's structured. But no current rebates come out of our money. Does that?
So say the $60,000 that you're giving residential buildings of houses.
So the rebate of the land,
So that does not come from any taxpayer in the city of Pekin.
it's a refund of the real estate taxes the homeowner pays us.
But where does the $60,000 up front come
No,
from?
we don't pay it up front. So again, I'm going to stick with my example because that's a
Okay.
number we've already used. So the lot costs $35,000. We're going to rebate the homeowner up to $35,000 in the future. We haven't paid anything yet.
Okay.
Yeah,
Good. Okay.
Yeah, so the mechanics of how that works, so somebody turns in proof that they paid $35,000 for this lot. After they build their house, they're eligible, depending on how much their house ends up being worth, they're eligible for up to that $35,000. They are paying $5,300 a year towards the TIF fund, and we're rebating them back a portion of that every year until they're paid back the $35,000. Through their own taxes. If they never build a house, if they don't pay their taxes on a year-to-year basis, they don't get any refund.
Then why on our tax bill that we've got a line item now that says TIF?
Yeah.
And we never had that before. The
Yeah.
last, was it 2 years, Steve? The last 2 years.
Yeah.
And the first year that we had it, our taxes increased 10%.
Yeah, so the TIF district is a geographic boundary that covers both vacant and already built-on lots. So if you're saying you live in a house that's in a TIF district, so every property that's in that TIF district, whether anything's happening to it or not, is a part of that TIF district and can receive benefits from that TIF district, such as road improvements, individual home improvements, depending on what the city council decides to actually spend that money on. So yeah, part of your tax bill is going towards that TIF fund, and it is regulated the same way, but we do not have any policy, and council's been pretty vocal about not having a policy to spend your tax dollars on somebody else's private property. So the dollars that you're saying you're paying, that is going to the TIF fund, and the TIF plan from 2023 when it was created includes something like $52 million worth of public improvements over that 23-year period that the TIF exists. So stormwater, do you live in the southwest end of town? Yeah, so just making sure I had the right TIF.
Right.
So things like stormwater improvements, repaving 14th Street someday, potentially correcting issues with the lake. I mean, all of those things become eligible improvements that over that 23 years, we can use those dollars to pay. So, I mean, another way to think about it, it's kind of like instead of the city raising general tax levy and using that money for anything, it's kind of like you're paying property taxes that are specifically allocated towards infrastructure. Now, I will say, other people will see the commercial TIF agreements too. The commercial TIFs are different. not legally. Legally, they're the same exact thing, but the way the city of Pekin uses them is different. We do some upfront grants and forgivable loans and things like that on the commercial side, but tonight we're just talking residential. Nobody's residential taxes and these residential TIFs is paying for anybody else's house to be built.
So I do want to say one thing. I think you're asking why all of a sudden, 2 years now, it's showing up in a different line where it never did before, correct?
Correct.
Correct. So what did?
Yeah, so 2
That
years.
come from the county clerk, separates your bill out on taxing districts. So why all of a sudden did it separate out 2 years ago?
Well, so
I
the
think that's her
TIF, the
question.
TIF was created 2 years ago, so that's why it started then. So it was created in 2023, so for, tax year, let's see, I think tax year 2024, get my tax years versus
23
payment years
paying
right.
24,
Yeah.
24 paying 25.
So that's why you've seen it twice now. So it was created 2 years ago, you've gone through 2 years of tax cycle, and you'll see it on there every year until the TIF ends, which is, set for like 2046, or, theoretically, it could be ended sooner.
So you're basically saying that it wasn't my taxes the TIF that increased, it was just my taxes in general increased 10%?
So a big portion of that, the way that the TIF taxes are created is they multiply the combined tax rate of all the taxing bodies. So park districts, schools, everybody, your combined rate, it's probably something like 9 or 10%. And they take that times your assessed value. Over the last 2 years, the assessors in the county, which we have nothing to do with.
Which they're in Cincinnati Township.
Okay, so yeah, the Cincinnati Township assessor, ultimately Tazewell County assessor, ultimately State of Illinois assessment process has increased assessed values like 12, 15% on average. So, last year alone, it was a 7% increase in assessed value. So we don't control that. We don't set that. We don't set a tax rate. And the city's tax levy number that we set is separate from the whole TIF conversation. So, we don't control that, but short answer is yes, your assessed value increased and therefore that money goes to the TIF because it's
Okay.
increasing.
Now, another question I have is, they drew a line down their street.
Yeah.
And all the neighbors on the other side of the street
Yeah, I get this
are
question a lot.
not paying the TIF, or it's not on their tax bill. And that really seems like selective districting to me, which happened on Washington Street years ago that maybe some of you don't even know about.
I do.
That we won that. We were on Washington Street at the time, and we won that lawsuit.
So wasn't that, I don't mean to interrupt you, but wasn't that market chasing or something like that?
They
Is that
did
how it
one
was worded?
street,
Yeah,
Washington
yeah,
Street.
Yeah, and they, that wasn't because of a TIF. They were chasing market values of other
Well,
properties.
correct, but
Yeah.
it was just one street,
Yeah,
and they,
yeah, that-
the
you're right.
Supreme, went to the Supreme Court.
Yep, you're right.
And they ruled that that was not a legal thing to do.
Correct.
And we got quite a bit of money back from that. But it just seems very strange that all the people on the other side of the street don't have that, and we do.
Yeah,
I don't know how they draw the
Jim
lines.
can maybe speak to the legality. The way I would say it, the TIF has boundaries. It legally has to have a boundary somewhere, and it's got to be somewhere. So a street is a pretty easy way to say this is where the boundary is going to be for a TIF district. And it's not just one street, right? It's kind of a wonky shaped map, kind of like the city's entire map is kind of wonky shaped. So the TIF was drawn the way it was drawn. I couldn't tell you why the people that chose it 2.5 years ago chose that street as the boundary, but the boundary had to be somewhere.
Yeah.
And that's, if I could just add to that, every TIF is like that. Like, it sounds oversimplifying it, but there's going to be a break point where you're either in the TIF or you're out.
Yeah.
And to your lawsuit, and I wasn't here for that lawsuit, I don't know if
Right.
a lot of us were here for that lawsuit.
Yeah, it's been a while back. Yeah.
It's not,
I was.
it is not there's not a lot of legal, nexus or connection between those two issues. Every TIF district has a specific, Josh was great, his explanations were great, and I appreciate him for doing that. But every TIF district has a specific line and boundaries, and they're picked for different reasons. Maybe maybe the contamination only goes so far. Maybe the flooding only goes so far. Maybe there's a reason that the distribution of ownership only goes so far, and that's the break point. So there's a terminus, a finality to each one of them. The one thing, if I had to do my presentation again, I would have this, which is the tax increment scale that we do. I guess that's kind of a deficiency. So you have taxes that go up, right? You have a frozen rate, which was Josh talked about. You have a time period, and the tax increment is this part. And so what it does is this is where your taxes come from. So it's only for that development. It's a common misconception, and I credit you for finding it out, that TIF increases taxes. They increase organically because of the development. But if you read the TIF Act, and I'm not a very interesting or exciting person, I've read the TIF Act, there's no language in there that talks about increasing taxes on its own. They happen because of the assessment process. And, you know, does it happen a lot of the time? Yeah, because it's a point. And we want the increment to go up so you guys can get a lake that gets dredged, for example.
That we pay for. A lot, I mean, we
Then-
pay a big portion of it.
Okay, then public infrastructure improvements or whatever the TIF increment or the increment goes to, that's where it's applied. But it doesn't independently increase the taxes on its own.
Yeah, Jim, I'd like to just make another point on that. So a lot of people ask me, you know, I'm paying more taxes because of the TIF. If we took your house or your property out of the TIF tomorrow, the taxes would be virtually exactly the same, because instead of going to the TIF line, it would just get redistributed to all the other taxing bodies. Now, the math is more nuanced than that, and we could certainly walk anybody through that if they want to set up a meeting with me. There's two ways to think about it, though. Like, if
That
the
is true.
entire TIF didn't exist, yeah, things would be different. But just taking your property or your neighbor's property out of the TIF does not materially change it by a penny.
So in
That's
other
true.
words, you are basically taking it out of other governmental funds, like the schools or whatever, to do that? Is that where the money's coming from then?
So we're not taking anything from the schools or any other governments. I guess what would be a fair point is the taxable value throughout their jurisdiction that they have access to is frozen when it comes to this TIF. So if they need to generate more revenue, they basically have to, through their levy, increase their tax rate. Now, like organically, as inflation goes up and values go up and governments increase their, levies with inflation, the tax rate basically stays the same, because all the dollars go up the same, all the tax rates stay the same. With the TIF district, that is, that's a fair criticism, I would say, that taxing bodies would have to, in essence, increase their tax rate to generate more revenue. One of the ways that we mitigate that concern is we have intergovernmental agreements with the school districts. School districts are generally, especially for residential development, they are highly impacted, right? Because residential development brings kids go to school. So, wise city councils of the past worked with the school districts and said, hey, we will enter into an agreement that every year we're going to give you, it's about 22% of the revenue. So even when we get, the however much you paid in towards that TIF district this last tax year, about 20% of that went to the schools anyway, because we decided to do that as a community. And not every community does that. Pekin decided to do that in all of the different TIFs, with one exception in which we actually have an agreement to give money back to all the taxing bodies, not just the schools. But that's in the weeds, and again, I'm happy to meet with anybody and explain all those nuances.
There's one aspect of that, on top of it is, do you remember when I talked about the but-for test? And that's part of the reason too, is the idea is that if you didn't have this type of development, and let's think about this more in the commercial context, it's probably easier to explain, but if you didn't have this type of development where the taxes get recycled back to the taxpayer, then you wouldn't have the growth to increase the taxes. So the schools aren't really losing out because the building, the project, whatever it is, that increases the taxes wouldn't be there unless they got the tax increment. So the growth is natural because of the TIF, right? And it would not have happened at all but for this thing that went through.
Josh, Jim, maybe, again, defer to your expertise on it, but with the TIF districts, there's the establishment of
Sure.
the TIF base itself, which, part of that is you have to identify the parcels, you have a series of studies and creating a plan and hearings and approvals. and it goes back into the establishment of that base value. And again, there's a lot of nuances to it. Based on your expertise, would you mind touching base on that, or?
Yeah, you pick out those properties or those pins, right? So all of our properties have a pin, right? Parcel identification number. And you pick out those pins on those properties that need the help through the increment, and you freeze that number of where the taxes are. And then as the growth comes in, because the development comes in, the money gets recycled, generally recycled to the taxpayer at that point in time. Or either specifically for commercial and more in the aggregate for large residential. Is that what you were asking about, or I don't know if I?
That does, and part of it too is, I guess, with the properties themselves and the studies that take place, sometimes it's the establishment of that, the base rate, when it gets frozen, how, basically the, kind of the math behind it, or how that's determined. Because based on my experience with TIFs in the past, it's often where you've seen something where you haven't seen the, going back to your but-for descriptions, you're not seeing that growth that would be taking off, right? So basically, going back to like the school districts and other organizations, you're not seeing a significant increase in the year-over-year receipts that are coming in. So that's where you get that frozen amount, and that's the items that are, and that's the revenue that you would see traditionally going back to school districts. And then we do have some agreements too, related specifically to the school districts, because it's primary source of funding, where they're gonna get maybe a percentage or something like that as well too. So this way they're kind of held harmless based off of traditional growth patterns and whatnot. So we happen to see that, and then there's the TIF and the increment beyond that, which is what we see going, flowing to those districts.
So if you have a surplus, if you have a surplus, then does that go back to the taxing bodies or come back to
Taxing
the
bodies.
residential people? I mean, the people
Well, I
paying
mean-
the taxes.
Yeah,
It
it's-
wouldn't be so that's an interesting question. Well, do you want to answer it, or do
I was just gonna say, mechanically, it goes back to the taxing bodies, and then
Yeah.
they use it for their general purposes of government that benefits the public.
Okay.
And then, but it's not, you asked a great question, but the way you phrase it is, if it goes back to the residents, it wouldn't by definition be a surplus. A surplus is something that's not allocated to somebody else.
Okay.
So I get your point, but Josh is 100% right. So we just closed out a TIF district, and there was a balance, and we had nothing to do, we had not allocated what the balance went for. And every one of them got their pro rata share of what the money was.
Okay.
Now, some places, as they know they're closing out, they'll make sure that there's allocations for, let's say, each taxpayer I'm just using a hypothetical, each taxpayer to get a proportionate share from that, and then it doesn't turn into surplus. So when you say, does it go back or does it become a
Yeah.
surplus? That definition, and I don't mean to be rude, but it kind of eats itself up, if that makes
Okay.
sense. So, but I'm talking myself in a circle. Josh is right, but sometimes at the end of a TIF district, the money just gets paid out to the taxpayers.
Yep. Yep.
May I
had to do
follow
that
up on that?
I
Yeah.
think Steve
You
had a
want up
question
here or
here.
No, just because it's a question for you,
Sure.
what you just said. If I understand correctly, this extra money that we're getting in because it's been the incremental money, because where it's now in a TIF district, the value's gone up, we get the value above and beyond what it was worth before we started. And I haven't seen the real estate tax bill, so I'm not quite sure how that's laid out. But when they put it on the real estate tax bill that it's, this is the TIF district, I assume that's just so that money gets allocated to the city and then the city divides it up. What we don't send back of your taxes, what we don't send to the school district, we use for putting aside for the big road projects that we want to do in our blighted areas and similar projects. So your money is going to go for the infrastructure, ultimately.
What if, can I add something to that? What if we say used and unused? Would that be a better way than saying surplus, like used and unused? Because if it's unused, then it goes back and it gets distributed to the taxing bodies. If it's used, it's allocated to a non-taxing body source. Does that make sense? Okay, and there's a little overlap there, because Josh, like Josh said, and honestly, most of our clients, whether it's the city here, my favorite client, or the other municipalities that we represent, we have sharing agreements with other taxing districts. It's just a better way to go, and it creates a better process for this. So surplus is kind of a misleading term, because it sounds like there's different things with bonds, and sometimes you issue bonds, and you have to have a reserve debt fund, and all this other more technical issues. So let's say used and unused, or allocated and unallocated. Is that a better way to do it?
Allocated and unallocated is much better.
Allocated, unallocated.
Okay.
Steve?
My name is Steve Meyer. I'm not nearly as nice as my wife, so this is not going to be fun. First of all, I understood this to be a residential TIF presentation. Very little of it's been actually about residential TIFs, other than your story at the beginning. Most of it just the mechanics of TIFs in general,
Sure.
okay?
I thought you might want to learn how this actually works, though.
I just want to know how it affects me, like all the other taxpayers. So, one of my question is, so you set up all these TIF districts, but not everybody pays into them, right?
I don't know who pays their taxes or not.
I mean, the whole city's not a TIF.
No, the
district,
whole
right?
city's not in a TIF district.
Okay, and my wife used the example of one side of the street is, one isn't.
Sure.
I don't understand that. I never will understand that. Common sense, I don't know, you guys might, I didn't hear it, but that's beside the point. You might look at PIN numbers. In our instance, 14th Street would have been an ideal division point, because even you start to talk about the lake extends out to 14th Street. The people on that side of our street are still going to be impacted by any infrastructure work that might be done on our street, hopefully sometime. So I don't understand that whole thing, but I also want to ask, okay, we had the last 2 years, we've paid $980 the first year, we paid $1,740 the second year. What's year number 3 going to be? And what's it going to be for the next 23 years?
I wish I could guess the tax numbers, because I would be a prognosticator. I would be someone who picked things that will happen in the future. I don't know. That's not a determination for the TIF districts. That's not a determination for actually the city to a large extent. That is based off the assessor, the township assessor, and the county assessor. So I can't tell you that. But that is not indicative of how you form a TIF, what a residential TIF is, or anything that has to do with the Tax Increment Allocation Act.
I would
I
tell
do
you
want to
this.
say, oh,
It's basically going to go up with what the assessor decides is inflation.
Okay, so next year, if I'm at 1740 now, and it goes up another 4%, which the assessor's probably doing more than that, but 4%, that's another $700. At what point does it end? I mean, in 23 years, I'll be putting in easily probably $60,000 to $65,000, easily.
Okay, but that, again, and I don't mean to be dismissive about it, but that is a function of the assessor's office and how they assess real property. That's not a function of the TIF Act.
So I think, if respectfully, I think you're off by 0. 4% of 1,700 is about $70. So it would go, if inflation is 4%, and that's what the inflation.
not the 1,700.
Okay.
Well, regardless.
And I do want to say that I am not in a TIF district. I live on the lake too, and I don't know how they drew the lines. I do have to sign that I don't live in a district being an elected official. And why is that? Because I
Yeah,
can't.
Anybody
I can't-
involved in the decision-making
I
process
cannot
for a
benefit
TIF
from
cannot benefit from
Cannot
it.
be on
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
So myself, city manager, attorneys, none of us can own property in a TIF. So any concern about, whatever, we're just doing it for ourselves, like, we're not allowed to. And that's, I think, evidence that we're following that policy. 2 of our new council members actually had their properties removed from the TIF so that they could participate in voting and discussion about it, and they can't benefit from it.
And it's part of the initial disclosure process as you're certifying TIF.
I'd like to step back for a second and make sure that I've got this correct. when we adopt a TIF district and we say, this house is in the TIF district, the county does whatever they do with the bill. Would their taxes be any different if we had the TIF district or not?
No.
No,
Yep,
that's
well,
exactly what he said.
I respectfully, there's kind of two ways to look at that question. If you're talking about one individual house being in a TIF or not, their taxes will be virtually the same. If we did not have any TIF districts, there would be less property taxes being generated. So yes to that question. So if we had no TIF district, nobody would be paying those extra property taxes, assuming that all the taxing bodies didn't increase their levies. Because that's kind of the other thing, right? If there is no TIF and inflation is happening, generally the taxing bodies increase with inflation, which, you know, the city has really fallen behind, partially because we have TIF districts.
But I think your question, you're 100% right. I think your question was, House A and House B are right next to each other. A is in a TIF, B is not in a TIF. Would that variance their taxes? Well, I'm gonna cut the hair a little bit. The assessor would have to make a determination on what the assessment value goes up. But no, it shouldn't. Like Josh said, it really shouldn't matter. It really shouldn't matter because it has nothing to do with the TIF district, unless you disagree. I mean,
Well, it's
holding
just-
those two variables constant on all their issues.
Yeah, I mean-
It shouldn't increase it.
Peg's, I mean, your direct question was if we did not have TIF districts, would property taxes be different?
Well, specifically what I'm saying is that when we adopt a TIF district, are we adding property taxes onto the existing homeowners in that area?
Unequivocally, no.
So the allocation of the bill, you're going to pay the $1,800 a year, whether you're in a TIF district or not. If it shows up on your bill as being allocated to TIF, that just means it comes into our bucket before we pass it out to the other buckets. And you're shaking your head and you're saying, no, your taxes went up because of the TIF district. I don't have the data. I'd be happy to look at it. If I'm wrong, but just because your bill goes up doesn't mean that that line you see is the reason for the change.
Okay, so you're gonna tell me that everybody saw an increase of, my assessment went up 11% on the 23 taxes, another 8% on the 24 taxes. You're telling me everybody in the city had those taxes raised that?
No, you said your assessment.
Yes,
You're talking about the value of your house.
right. But then-
So you're-
but then
you're-
the
wait a
tax-
minute.
The taxes also went up 10% and almost 6%. So they followed right along with my increase in my assessment.
Well, that's how the taxes are
taxes are
calculated.
I understand
It's a
that. So you're
percentage of the
But you're
assessment.
telling me everybody in the cities went up,
Not saying-
assessed 11% and then 8%.
Well, see, the assessment has absolutely, I mean, as far as I know, we could talk to an assessor, but they don't come into the neighbor and go, oh, well, these houses are all worth more money now because they're in a TIF district. They go through and they say, hey, based on the way the market's running, these are what these houses are worth now. The TIF did not change any percentages. It didn't add on any buckets. At this juncture, I don't think it's increased the value.
No, it
So,
hasn't.
so therefore, that increase, if you don't think that's right, that's a discussion you have with the county, the supervisor of assessments in your area.
Well, we fought that for 15 years back when we first built, and we finally got it changed, because the assessor wouldn't listen to us, but he finally did, when they changed assessors.
And of course, there's ways for everybody. I mean, I know this is not about assessments. If we want to have another presentation about assessments, we could have it. But there are ways for the people who don't know that you can contest your tax bill and there's different exemptions that come into play. But this is not about that. This is about something separate.
Right, I understand that.
I don't-
Okay, so what I just want to know, a couple of things. First of all, if you read up on PTEL, I'm sure you know what that is.
100%.
Can you just tell us property tax extension, limited liability or something? There is the PTEL that sets the amount of which they can increase the levy. Unless you're a municipality like Pekin and you're home rule, then you don't, PTEL doesn't apply. So then you're the lesser of CPI, consumer price index or 5%. Is that right so far? Am I correct? Pretty sure I am.
Yeah.
Okay, you're wondering what that has to do with anything.
It's 4.9.
Yeah, I don't mean, yeah, I don't,
Okay.
but go on, yeah.
What I'm getting at is that determines the levy. There are two things that determine the taxes you're going to pay, and one of them is the levy. The other is the assessment. The PTEL has a lot to do with the levy, like Beacon 108, they're under PTEL. Library, well, you set the library at 4%, the city got to do that. City took 4%, they could have took 5%, but they gave us 4%. So you got two things that always determine your taxes, your property taxes, and it's assessment value, governed usually by PTEL unless you're under home rule, and then you have the assessed value. That is actually determined by the state, if not determined by the township, because you have what's called an equalization factor. The state determines whether we're keeping up with what they think our market values are, right?
You're 100% right.
So fortunately, with the county clerk and that, they can look at that and set it by township before they let the state decide that. Okay, that's another aspect of it. Now, the question I think I have is,
That actually comes from the supervisors of assessments before it goes to
Right.
the clerk, yes.
it's all based on what's called a sales ratio study that
Correct.
they get from the state.
Correct.
But here's my thought. If the levy is frozen, what do you call that, by the way? EAV or something?
EAV.
Okay, what's the E? I forgot. Equalized asset value, assessment value.
Assessment value.
Okay, that's supposedly frozen. It's kind of like, looks like a triangle within a triangle, the little triangle within the bigger triangle. The assessment, okay, the reason the assessment goes up from the TIF, the way I understand it, is you're doing, supposedly, they were intended for blighted areas originally, or improvement to infrastructure, so you get redevelopment and other people coming in. So the intent is actually, the TIF is to increase the values of everybody's homes in the area. So you do see an increase in your property tax because you will ultimately see an increase in your assessment value. Because that TIF's gonna naturally do that. You're gonna make an improvement. And if you make an improvement, the value of your house goes up. And if you're across the street and you're in the TIF, if you're in the TIF district or you're not in the TIF district, your market value is going to be based on that house next to you. So
Okay,
it's a comparative, it's called comparative or comps. So they're going to look over at your house. I don't care if you're in the TIF district or not, and this one is and this one isn't. You're right across the street from each other. Is your house worth as much as that house? They're going to do an assessment of the property around you. So that's going to drive up, a TIF ultimately should, I think it will, drive up property values. Okay? I don't think I'm wrong on that either. Somebody's,
Yeah, that's the point.
right.
Yeah.
But what you have to do, if your levy's not getting enough and you got, I can't ever think of the acronyms, the Illinois Municipal Retirement Fund,
IMRF, yeah.
IMRF, somebody's got to put money into that, okay? So that's going to go up. Those people are going to want their raises every year. And unfortunately, they always get a bigger raise than I do in my Social Security, so I'll argue that's not fair. But anyway, what I think happens there is the levy determines it. Yeah, I know what the schools get all kinds of things like evidence-based funding and grants and money from the state. You can thank Chicago and state of Illinois for putting a lot of mandates, unfunded mandates, and other things on our backs, local governments, because they're not giving as much state money back as they used to. That is raising your property tax. So you can blame Chicago if you like, but Chicago has a lot to do with why our property taxes here are going up. But I think, if you have to get more money to put into the budget for the school, for their levy, and part of that is paying salaries and whatever, or the retirement pension. Correct me on which part it is that they're paying, but isn't there going to be an issue of changing the tax ratio at that point? to get more money out of the base if the base is frozen? Because it never goes up, does it?
Yeah, I think I'm with you, sir. So this goes back to the point earlier about how assessments generally go up with inflation, but if it's frozen and you have a entity like the school who's subject to PTEL and they can only levy with inflation, then their levy capability is restricted because the TIF district exists. That is accurate. Now, again, one of the things we do to deal with that issue is have direct agreements with the schools that says, we know that we're kind of screwing your guys' levy up, so we're going to agree to give you 20%, or, it's split, right? 303 gets 12% and 108 gets 11%, whatever it is. We agree to give you some of this money above and beyond so that you're made whole. And for the schools in particular, it's a big deal because they do see a lot of direct impact from growth. A park district grows when they buy land and expand fields and things like that. Just because there's 18 people instead of 17 people on the soccer team doesn't really increase their numbers, but it does for a school. So I think that's your point. So we acknowledge that you're right, that, for a PTEL organization, we are restricting their ability to keep their revenues in line with costs as inflation goes up. But we're dealing with that with intergovernmental agreements.
Then you take a look at the schools, and if you listen to the superintendent, Mary, you can figure this out or tell me if this is right, but I hear you speak about the number of poor people in our city, and I think the number of students that are like on certain programs in our high school and stuff is really high. And I'm wondering, like, how many people in the city of Pekin are considered poor? I heard it was 50%. What is the number?
It's higher than that, I believe.
No, it's, so under
No?
the Community
No.
Development Block Grant Program, numbers are set by the Federal Department of Housing and Urban Development. They study poverty, they study all those things.
Yeah.
We are not considered a majority impoverished community. It would actually make the cities, I'm not gonna say that because that's not good. You don't want an impoverished community, right?
That's correct.
Because we're not, we have to follow a lot of extra rules in how we use that CDBG money. The actual number is around 45%, 48%. So less than half is considered by the federal government to be impoverished, which is low to moderate income. It doesn't mean, minimum wage, it's above that, but it is considered low to moderate income.
What are you saying? Are you saying we are or we aren't, or are you just saying that's how they set the number?
I'm saying the federal government considers about 45% of the residents of Pekin to be in low to moderate income.
So
Okay,
not
so you have
50.
45% then. Okay, not 50, but
Not
40,
50.
The
but
actual-
45.
The poverty rate of people that are in poverty is way lower than that. It's 10, 15%, but what's considered low to moderate income, which qualifies you for a lot of grants and things like that, that's about 48%. So that's
Well-
qualifying for a lot of programs through schools.
Right.
That's the number you're
Well,
looking for.
where I'm going with that is, if you take a look and drive around Pekin enough, you're wondering who has the money to pay property tax. And you look at the areas that can and cannot. And I've traveled to a number of areas that I don't think can. And then you look at the number of disabled people or vets, disabled senior citizens. I think the tax base is being kind of burdened on those who have more, give more, than those who don't, who can't and give less. So it kind of feels like you get singled out to take care of everyone else because it is so impoverished in Pekin. You see what I'm getting at?
Yeah, I mean, the way the Illinois property taxes work is inherently a progressive system. If you own a more expensive property, you're going to pay more in property taxes. And if you can't afford as expensive a property and you live in a cheaper house, a more modest house, you're going to pay less.
But think about this. If you go to the superintendent and you talk to Danielle Owens, she'll say that 50% number. She might be referencing the number of students who really can't afford their education, but what I'm getting at is that's a lot of people. I mean, okay, District 108 is what, 60-some% of our property tax? And like 40%, or not 40%, I'm getting the numbers mixed up. But when you look at what 108 and 308, what you pay in taxes for those two, if those students are coming from families or they're unable able to support the schools, then the rest of us are supporting that, is what I'm getting at.
Right, I think, and I'll let Josh or Jim correct, but, you know, there's a lot of factors that go into it. You could have one family that's in poverty that has 3 students going in there. That doesn't mean you have 3 different households that are in poverty. And you also have to take into consideration, to your point about owning property, Pekin has a significant amount of rental properties in town, about a third of the properties in town. They're owned by people that don't necessarily live in Pekin. They live in another state. They buy up properties and they rent that property. So those are the people paying the property taxes on that. So you have to take that in. I mean, there's variables to everything you're in there. And then there's people that do own the property. That's what they could afford that have that impact. See, there's a lot of different things. I think to your point as well, what Danielle Owens is saying, and I can't speak for her, I wasn't there for that conversation, but I've heard that 50% number. So if you have that one household and they have, you know, what's the population of Pekin in the high school, 1,700, and they're saying 50%, that's in the student body. The poverty rate of Pekin is hovering about 13% in there. So, you know, but that number could be different because you have 3 kids that are in high school and one poverty thing, but that's 3. That's how they're counting it. So it's kind of apples to oranges when you're comparing it in that, compared to that household. So those numbers, you know, get thrown in there. And you know, I heard the 50% number and I'm like, that's not the number I saw. And then as we started looking into it a little bit more, they're different. So they're, you know, so out of the, I don't know, I'm guessing 1,700 students, 50% are in poverty, or you know, they come from a family or a household that is poverty. But you could have 3 kids there from one household. So that's the
I
difference.
want to kind
wanna
of
make
tie
sure
this
that we're-
discussion back to
Yeah.
residential TIF, but it's a good point.
I know this
Yeah,
is
I actually did have a
important.
question about the residential TIF.
Sure, I know this is important to everybody too, but go right ahead.
I was hearing
Chris?
Myers asking the questions that I think I'm talking about. Right, am I right? Okay. I like the one residential TIF example that's was on the Pekin website. I don't know if you updated the website, but it was, the example you gave was $40,000. And so a person goes and buys a condo, they're gonna get $4,000 in a rebate every year for 10 years to get that $40,000. Now, don't take this as the way it happens everywhere, but my neighbor, ex-neighbor, retired, moved into a condo over in Remington. They're getting that $40,000. They live in Pekin. They didn't need to move, but they wanted to get that condo, and they did. The people who moved into their house were also from Pekin. There's no outsiders coming into Pekin on account of that one that I know of, unless you keep cascading down to who bought the other house. But to me, I didn't see anything but an opportunity for my neighbor to pay less taxes. Now, they're up there in age. They probably have a senior citizen freeze to boot. So I don't see them necessarily paying as much property tax as everybody else. I think that's an example for me where it doesn't work. I could be wrong, but I don't see why that is advantageous unless you just got a one-off.
I'm gonna, this is maybe a little too personal, but it is, it's out there. I sold a home the year that I turned 65 and should have got the exemption. So I didn't get it.
Mary, I
because-
didn't even know you were over 65. Are you serious?
Thank you. Serious. Okay.
Okay.
So from then, I went to a new home, a different home, not new, let me tell you, a different home. That didn't follow. So I lost out on that, but the people that bought my house got my exemption. So I hear what you're saying, that it's kind of a one-off because they weren't over 65, but I didn't get it because I moved to a different home and I wasn't in that house for a year to get it. So,
Yeah, I want to
Yeah.
add on to that.
Yeah, yeah.
We only pay back portions of what people pay on their tax bill. So if you have all the exemptions in the world and you don't actually pay anything on your tax bill, you won't get a rebate from us. So if you're taking a senior exemption, homeowner occupied exemption, disabled veteran anything like that, you can't get a rebate on exemptions.
Yep.
It's only based on what you've actually paid, and that's why the residential program seems to be working really well, because we're not just throwing money at projects. You know, we're actually forcing construction to happen, prove that it happened, prove that you're paying your property taxes, and then we'll incentivize you by doing a rebate for a short, relatively short period of time. And after that 6 or 8 years, for the next 50 to 100 years, the taxing bodies are collecting additional revenue they would not have had. Now, to your question about kind of people moving from one part of town to another part of town, kind of two ways to look at it. Number one, a new house got built and it's generating new property taxes regardless of who lives in it. So that's a good thing.
And construction dollars.
For sure, yeah, building trades. Number two, like you said, and you alluded to, if you go far enough down the chain, it's not like, people are just circling Pekin, 3 houses in a year. Like at some point, there is somebody from out of town that buys that, 5th house that was vacated in your cascade of what you were talking about. And furthermore, one of the biggest things that I see as the economic development director, when manufacturers want to build here, when medical offices want to build here, we talk to these commercial developers, they want to know what's your workforce look like? What are your housing options look like? What are your amenities? We're rich in some of those things. We got 4 golf courses. We got a really good park district. We don't have housing available. So it is sometimes really hard to get manufacturers and other big economic development opportunities to come to Pekin because they just don't believe there's going to be a place for their workers to live around here, and therefore they're not going to be able to find workers. So incentivizing housing also brings big picture, long-term things that when we're talking about a generational decision that the city council is making for the next 20 plus years, these small decisions now are adding up to really big impacts later on. And that's why TIFs last 23 years, because it takes time.
I'm going to give you a really good example. We had a mayor's roundtable, and I know I'm getting way off subject. My attorney's going to call me out on this, but we had a mayor's roundtable, and I said that City of Pekin, we have Epic Medical coming. They're bringing 100 jobs. The City of Peoria, there's 400 Caterpillar engineers coming back to the City of Peoria. There's no housing. So that's another reason why we would have a TIF incentive. And we were actually praised on the City of Pekin's TIF incentive when we went up to the IML on how well the City of Pekin's TIF districts are working. And other cities need to listen to how we're doing it. So we are hoping that new homes will be built in the City of Pekin. Some of the land that we just purchased, 1,000 acres, we'd love to have all those homes built right there, just for those 400 jobs and the 100 jobs here. I was so excited that we were bringing 100 jobs, and when the mayor of the City of Peoria said she's bringing 400, I'm like, wah, wah. But I know, I realize that. And I'm getting way off subject, other than TIF district, correct me if I'm wrong, but we were praised more than once on how our TIF district is a perfect example on how things are working to bring incentives and bring people or new homes in the City of Pekin. Correct?
Yeah, I mean, we're told from our real estate agents that they try to show places in Pekin, and there's only 30 houses for sale, and there's not places for a CAT executive or a new doctor to move into in Pekin. So they move to Morton, they move to Washington, they move to Dunlap, whatever.
Yep.
And they shop there, and they eat there, and they raise their kids there, and their kids stay there and build houses. So instead, if you can make that one short-term decision that has a 100-year impact, I think it's a home run.
I have the mic. Does somebody here want to talk?
I don't know if
Because I'm
Steve
holding
was
the
done,
mic
if you're
and-
done.
Somebody?
Okay, regarding Peg's scenario where that retired couple built their house and they have the incentive of that rebate. Now, let's say they just want to move to Florida and they sell their house. Does that rebate pass on to the new owners then?
Yeah, so generally, when we write a TIF agreement, we don't make it assignable. We understand people buy and sell houses, and for good reason, we do make the residential ones run with the property. So if somebody gets a TIF incentive to build a house this year, they can't like flip it next year and keep getting the benefit. The benefit goes to the new owner that is living in that house now.
That was a good question. Steve, were you finished? Okay.
Do we have any questions from our, before we get,
Not a question, but a comment that I moved here a couple years ago. I had to build after spending probably a year looking for housing that needed to be handicap accessible because of family members, and I know I will probably be there. Had to build. The realtor who had worked with me for a whole year said, you're only gonna get what you want if you build. So,
And was it in a TIF district?
yes,
There you go.
yes, it was. I don't know. We knew the builder, P&W builder.
Yeah.
And he really encouraged us to build in this TIF district. So I don't know if it was to his advantage or to mine.
Yours.
Thank you.
I hope you did a better job on your house than you did mine.
P&W builder. Well, we supervised a lot.
Councilmember Phillips, there are some people watching. There are no comments in the chat.
Excellent, thank you. Last
Can I
chance.
ask one more question then? Unless somebody jumps up here and wants it, I'll give it to them. But I just want to know, we have what, 5 or 6 TIF districts, and I guess everybody's seen, it sounds like you've already looked at the interactive map where you can look at the layers, right? And I couldn't find hardly any streets that wasn't a TIF district. I mean, pretty much all of Pekin seems to be a TIF district of overlap somewhere. Is that true? Because I don't see much left that can be converted to a TIF district. And then the second part of that is, if I'm in a TIF district, is it because my area is blighted or I'm paying for another area that's blighted? And if I am, either way, and we're all in the TIF, in a TIF, it seems like we just self-defeated ourselves somehow.
Right, so your first question is the whole town in a TIF? No. It is,
Pretty close.
it reaches all edges of the town, but they're relatively skinny lines in most places. So, I might be able to show a map up there as we kind of wrap up. I can go put the map up on the screen so that people online can see it.
I just, if you could bring it up and start turning the layers on and off, I think
I
you'll
can.
see just how not
Well, they don't-
overlap, but
They
how.
don't overlap each other.
They do not
really.
overlap, they cannot overlap, that would be wrong.
Right.
But they do take up most of the area.
I will
of
say
Pekin.
most of the downtown area is in a TIF district.
Because that
And
is-
then there's like stretches, right? So like our industrial park is, but really it's just like the stretch along 29, all that industrial area is. The stretch along Court Street to get out to the far east side where there's nothing built, there's some up, is that 14th Street, I think? Maybe it's Parkway. I'm not sure which road it is. The map's not working correctly for me, but there's like a skinny shot that goes up. So most of the core of town, most of Old Town, most of, the older subdivisions are not. It's really those areas that are primed for more new development and new opportunity where there's opportunity for development, but there's barriers, whether it be flooding or obsolete platting or other things like that. Will it remind me your second question?
I'm trying to remember, there was 3 parts to it. but-
Is your house versus the area considered, qualifying for a TIF?
Yeah,
So blight
is
conditions,
the blight condition within the TIF that I'm in or outside of the TIF that I'm
so if
in?
you go to the
Am I a
state.
TIF
Yeah,
supporting
Yeah.
a blighted area?
if you go to the state statute, you'll read the word blight is there's a lot of conditions that you can meet. Actual like physical deterioration is only one of the criteria for blight. So I just want to throw that out there. If you are in a TIF district, the majority of the properties in that district have to qualify. So it's not your neighbor who's outside of the TIF district or 3 blocks down outside of the TIF district. They don't qualify for anything. and they don't help your area qualify for blight. Within your geographic TIF district, the majority of the properties have to meet the criteria.
And the criteria is blight?
Yeah, Jim,
I mean, I,
Jim, you don't happen to know the statute off the top
I
of
know
your
you
head?
can say-
There's a whole list.
Yes, the criteria, I can go through the list, but there are different criteria and the different number of criteria depending on whether it's vacant or constructed,
I
whether
mean, you could
it's
have
blight or
really bad
conservation area.
infrastructure, right? That needs replaced?
Correct.
Yeah, that would be one. That would be insufficient utilities would be part of infrastructure. That would be.
You might look
replaced.
good, but
can read you a
underneath,
list.
things are bad.
Yeah, you pull out the list.
Yeah, so dilapidation or, disrepair of actual structures, obsolescence, so it's it's ill-suited for the area. So if you started to build a bunch of houses around an industrial area, that industrial area would be considered ill-suited now. Deterioration of buildings, structures below modern code standards, illegal use of structures, excessive vacancy of structures, lack of ventilation, lighting, and sanitary facilities, inadequate utilities, excessive land coverage and overcrowding of structures on top of the land.
What's that supposed to mean?
So like if there's no grass, right? If it's a block and it's got a house and a garage and a shed and another house and it's all just too tightly packed for anybody to really live, that's a criteria. Deleterious land use or layout, environmental cleanup, lack of planning for the area. And then another big one that does usually help qualify a lot of areas is if the total assessed value of that area has been declining. So that's all for land with structures on them. There's a whole nother list of vacant land that qualifies, and that gets into a lot of, it's an old railroad area, it's an old mine, it's got flooding on the property, all that kind of stuff.
So to the points you're making, and my question for the lawyer here would be, then you have to write up the paperwork to verify that those are the criteria that are being met.
Absolutely, no, I mean, it's not lawyers who generally do it, it's TIF consultants. There's actually a small field of municipal consultants that write up TIF reports. And, it borders on the legal, we normally review it, and it's normally supported, as Josh said, I mean, for the building out structures, they'll take pictures of dilapidated structures and affix them. And like we talked about in the presentation, that you have real evidence. A good TIF report will have real evidence to go forward. The easiest one is always the declining EAV, because you just attach the EAV tables and you show that it's declining. But so it's TIF consultants, they actually write this up. They are generally not lawyers, they do work with lawyers. We've done it before, we opine on them before.
So you're just overlooking everything then?
The reporting.
Yeah, for example, the
kind of,
most
yeah.
recent TIF districts that were established, we had a TIF consultant, so Jacob and Klein is a law firm. They have an arm called the Economic Development Group. They put a lot of that stuff together, and then they even had further independent consultants do things like flood studies and all that kind of stuff. So the city doesn't control the data. Our lawyer generally does not control the data, right? That we make sure that, the consultant did their job appropriately, but really we rely on those independent consultants to give us the data. And if it doesn't qualify, it doesn't qualify. I mean, that's you have to do a study to see if it qualifies before you can establish it.
There's
you
been many
calling-
times we've gone through the process and asked for the study to get started, and it just didn't meet it. And the consultants will stop you, and not in this municipality. But a consultant stopped us and they said, we've gone out to the hydrological people. We've gone out to the environmental people, and there's just no factors there. And then it just stops. But no, it's not me or any other lawyer generally who does it. It's a TIF consultant.
Just to clarify, Jacob Klein is what now?
Jacob and Klein is a legal group, so similar, like Viselli Law is our corporate attorney. Jacob and Klein is the attorney that the city has had a relationship with for many years to specifically administer the legal aspects of our TIF districts.
But they are not the TIF consultant.
They have a partner group called the Economic Development Group, that's just the name of their group, that does TIF consulting work and finds the independent study people and puts together the reports and then ultimately presents it to joint review boards. So yes, I mean, yes and no. They are both attorneys and TIF consultants because they're partners.
Okay.
but they are not our corporate attorney,
Yeah,
you know,
okay, all right.
they're.
Well, I've seen their
independent.
stuff out there, but then I started thinking maybe you were them, and then I realized,
I am not them, I mean, but we represent, I mean, actually, we do a lot of TIF work on the private side, we do a lot of TIF work on the public side. I've presented to the Illinois Tax Increment Association multiple times about establishing TIF districts, corporate TIF districts and incentive agreements. So it's, if you work in the field, there's not a lot of us, but if you work in the field, you kind of know each other. Does that make sense?
yeah.
All right.
Okay,
Oh, I'm sorry.
So maybe I missed this when you were talking. So if I'm in a TIF district, our home is, so does that mean that money set aside for that TIF district can only be used in the TIF district I'm in?
Good question. The law allows for TIF money to be spent in that TIF district or in a directly adjacent TIF district. So if you're in the South Residential TIF.
Right.
And, you know, directly adjacent to you is our Court Street TIF, the money can go between those two. We cannot daisy chain it though, so we cannot say, well, this is adjacent to this, and that's adjacent to that, and that's
Oh,
we
okay.
can't do that. We can only go one over. So it's still your neighborhood essentially, right? It's still that.
Okay.
So, I mean, for example, you know, we're fully transparent about how we spend our dollars and do our budgeting. Part of the budget for this year for the Southern Residential TIF District included, I want to say either $50,000 or $100,000 to go towards the main Court Street construction project that the entire community, you know, uses that road. So all of the TIF districts are generally adjacent to the court TIF, so they're all helping fund that major project.
so we thank you every day. That's a $35 million
Right.
project for Court Street.
And another thing, going back to the high school and the school districts, I know what you're saying with Daniel Owens and stuff about that. And the way the school district looks at it, because I was a business manager for Morton School Districts for quite a few years, we look at free and reduced, who qualifies for free and reduced lunches. And Pekin is at about 95%.
It's
Of
up
that.
there.
The grade schools just decided that no one has to pay for a lunch because it was such a small percentage of
You're
people that
correct.
could pay for a lunch.
You're correct.
So trying to say that, well, there's 3 kids or whatever, a school district is a very good cross-section of the community. And it's at the grade school level, the high school level, both of those, that we are at poverty level when you look at that. If people can't even afford to give their children lunch money. That's where she gets that, yeah, that's where she, because
Yeah.
school superintendents and so forth really rely on who qualifies for free and reduced lunch for a lot of grants they get and
Yeah.
so forth to help with that.
Sure,
Yeah,
and,
yeah.
and that's totally fair, and just keep in mind, the qualifications for free and reduced lunch does not necessarily mean
No.
it's the same qualification for getting road infrastructure money or getting, you know, whatever else from the state.
Correct.
The state wants to help fund food for kids, so they make that a pretty broad, you can qualify for. I was on it when I was a kid, right, I mean. you know,
Yeah, but it
um,
really is, if you think about it, if you can't
Yeah.
afford to pay for your children's lunch, you're not in a very high income level.
That's right. That's right. Well, unless we have any other questions, I do want to, I don't have to ask for an adjournment since we don't have a quorum, but I do want to thank everybody for taking the time, coming out. And I want to thank Ms. Phillips for, she came to me and came to us, and she wanted to try her best to put some fires out, educate, whatever. Don't hesitate to reach out more to Mr. Vaselli, Ms. Phillips, Joshua Ray. I personally want to say, I'm sorry you didn't get a call back. I had mentioned it to certain people, and I'm not quite sure why it fell through the cracks. But please don't hesitate to call again. And I want to wish everybody a Merry Christmas, Happy New Year. Unless someone has anything else to say, we're adjourned.
Thank you for
Yeah.
I've been wanting somebody on the council
Yeah.
to do this.
Yeah.
And I've talked to a couple people about it.
It's not an easy subject.
Action and said, how come we don't talk about TIF?
Yeah.
Now we have.
Yeah, yeah. We're trying to pick, this is our third one, we're trying to pick some good subjects. Thank you, everyone.